Hollywood rarely pauses, but this time the silence felt different. When news broke that Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner were found dead inside their Brentwood home, the industry didn't just lose a legendary filmmaker, it lost a sense of safety it never admits it needs. For days there were tributes, condolences, and cautious headlines. Then Billy Crystal finally spoke. He didn't offer a theory. He didn't point fingers. He said something far more unsettling. He didn't listen to my warning. Those 7 words reframed everything. Because Billy Crystal is not a man drawn to drama. Throughout his career, he has been vocal about protecting family, emotional stability, and the quiet spaces where life is supposed to feel safe. He once said he doesn't joke about things that destroy families. And yet here he was admitting that he saw something coming and couldn't stop it. What makes this story disturbing isn't just how it ended, but how early the signs appeared. A private conversation, a growing unease, a home that no longer felt like shelter. This is not a story about an investigation or a verdict. It is about warnings that arrive before people are ready. The moment that would later haunt Billy Crystal did not begin with sirens, headlines, or shock. It began with a phone call. On a quiet afternoon, 14 days before everything collapsed, his phone rang. On the other end was Rob Reiner. His voice sounded familiar, yet subtly off, flatter, heavier, as if weighed down by something he had been carrying alone. Rob didn't waste time on small talk. He didn't joke, didn't reference work, didn't mention a script or an idea. He said only one thing: come over. I need to talk to you. This isn't about a movie. For Billy, that sentence alone was enough to raise concern. In decades of friendship, Rob had never called him like that, not without context, not without warmth. Billy arrived at the Brentwood house shortly after 4 in the afternoon. The timing would later replay in his mind again and again. It wasn't late. It wasn't rushed. Nothing about the visit suggested urgency, and yet everything about it felt wrong. This was the first quiet shift, the first moment when something ordinary began to feel unfamiliar. Rob opened the door himself. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked tired in a way Billy had never seen before, not the fatigue of long shoots or creative pressure, but the exhaustion of someone who had been holding tension for far too long. As Billy stepped inside, he sensed it immediately. This was not a visit between friends. It was a conversation Rob had delayed for too long and no longer knew how to finish. The Brentwood house had always been a place of easy noise, televisions murmuring, music drifting from another room, conversations overlapping without effort. That afternoon, it was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. As Billy Crystal stepped inside, he noticed what wasn't there before he registered what was. No television, no music, no familiar hum that usually softened the edges of Rob Reiner's home. Rob led him toward the living room without turning anything on. He poured 2 glasses of water, set them on the table, and then didn't touch his own. The small detail lodged itself in Billy's mind. Rob was a creature of habit. He never forgot to drink the water he poured. That day his hands hovered, then retreated as if his body knew something his words refused to say. Rob's appearance only deepened the unease. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, sleeves rolled past his wrists, hair uncombed. When they shook hands, the grip was weaker than usual. Not fragile, just drained. Throughout the first minutes of silence, Rob's eyes kept drifting toward the hallway leading deeper into the house. He looked there, then away, then back again, like someone listening for a sound that never came. Billy sat and waited. He didn't interrupt the quiet. Years of friendship had taught him when humor would help and when it would only get in the way. This was the second moment that would later haunt him, the realization that the house itself no longer felt like shelter. It felt watchful. Nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices, no sudden revelations. Yet the absence of normalcy spoke louder than any confession. The home that once absorbed stress and sent it back out, softened, now seemed to hold it in. Silence stayed heavy and unmoving. The silence finally broke when Rob Reiner spoke again, his voice lower than before, stripped of its usual certainty. He didn't circle the subject or soften it with humor. He went straight to the reason he had asked Billy Crystal to come over. He talked about his son, Nick Reiner. Rob explained that Nick had suffered a serious relapse earlier that month. What worried him most wasn't only the substance use but the shift in behavior that followed. Nick had become irritable, reactive, set off by remarks that once would have passed unnoticed. There were nights when he came home emotionally unstable, pacing unable to settle. On more than one occasion, Michelle had quietly left the bedroom and slept elsewhere, not out of anger, but out of caution. Rob paused as he said this, rubbing his forehead, staring down at the floor. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It felt involuntary, like a man trying to hold together thoughts that no longer fit neatly. He described a confrontation in the kitchen roughly a week before Thanksgiving. The argument centered on money and treatment, but Rob admitted it was the tone that frightened him most. He hadn't recognized his son's reactions. For the first time, he felt unable to predict where the conversation might lead. What struck Billy wasn't fear in Rob's voice, but exhaustion. This was not a father venting frustration. This was a man admitting that something fundamental had shifted. Rob said he was keeping Nick close, believing the presence of family might stabilize him. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, as if testing whether he still believed them himself. That moment marked the first true psychological fracture. Rob wasn't describing a problem he felt capable of managing. He was describing one he was enduring. As he finished, the room fell silent again. Billy understood then that this conversation wasn't about advice. It was about confession, and the quiet hope that speaking the fear aloud might somehow keep it contained. After a long pause, Rob Reiner finally said the sentence that would linger with Billy Crystal long after he left the house. His voice dropped almost to a whisper, as if he were admitting something only to himself. "I can't see my own son as a threat." It wasn't a declaration, it was a confession. Rob leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced tightly, his knuckles pale with pressure. He explained that Nick had gone through dark periods before and had always found his way back. What terrified him now was the possibility that one wrong move, one moment of rejection, could push his son past a point of return. Rob believed that keeping Nick close was an act of protection, not just for his son, but for the fragile balance holding the family together. Billy listened carefully. He understood the instinct. He had known Rob long enough to recognize the depth of his loyalty, especially as a father, but this time he responded differently than he ever had before. He sat up straighter, held Rob's gaze, and spoke with a firmness that surprised even himself. He told Rob that love did not cancel risk, that trust, while natural, could become dangerous when behavior grew unpredictable, and that continuing to absorb everything in silence might place both Rob and Michelle in harm's way. Rob didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He nodded slowly, eyes reddening as if every word landed exactly where it hurt most. He said he understood the warning. He truly did. But the idea of seeing his own child as a threat felt impossible, like a betrayal of everything he believed fatherhood meant. That was the trap neither of them could escape. If Rob pushed Nick away, he feared his son would collapse. If he kept Nick close, the tension inside the home continued to rise. There was no option that felt safe, only choices that carried different kinds of pain. Billy sensed it then. This wasn't a problem waiting for a solution. It was a moral stalemate built from love and fear feeding each other. For a moment, neither man spoke. The house seemed to hold its breath with them. And in that silence, something unspoken settled between them, the understanding that even the clearest warning cannot always overcome a bond forged by blood. The conversation ended without resolution. Billy Crystal could sense it immediately, not resistance, not denial, but something quieter and more dangerous. Acceptance without action. Rob Reiner stood up, walked toward the window, and stared out at the backyard where so many family gatherings had once taken place. He rested his hand against the glass, then turned back with a faint, exhausted smile. "I hear you," Rob said softly. "I really do." He added that he would rethink everything after Thanksgiving. The words sounded calm, reasonable, even hopeful. But to Billy, they felt like delay, as if time itself were being asked to handle what only a hard decision could resolve. Rob reached out and squeezed Billy's shoulder, a familiar gesture meant to reassure. In that moment, Billy understood something unsettling. The warning had been delivered, it had been understood, and yet it hadn't truly landed. Billy left the house as dusk settled over Brentwood. The light was fading, but it wasn't dark yet, and that detail stayed with him. Nothing dramatic had happened inside. No raised voices, no confrontation. Still, a weight followed him to the car, a quiet certainty that something important had been postponed rather than faced. As he drove away, one thought repeated itself: this conversation would not resolve on its own. Rob hadn't dismissed the warning, he had absorbed it, trusted love and time to soften what fear could not. Billy told himself he had done what a friend should do. He had spoken honestly. He had not crossed a line. But the silence came with him. It lingered through the evening and into the days that followed. In hindsight, this would become the moment everything balanced on a thin edge, the point where the warning didn't fail because it was wrong, but because it arrived in a place where love had already decided what fear was not allowed to become. When the news finally broke, Billy Crystal didn't begin by asking what had happened. His first reaction was quieter and more unsettling. Something about the sequence felt wrong, not chaotic, not violent in the way headlines often suggest, wrong in a subtler way. The Brentwood house had never been a place of prolonged silence. Rob and Michelle lived with rhythm, scheduled calls, regular visits, people coming and going. Yet the tragedy was only discovered when someone arrived according to plan, knocked repeatedly, and received no response. Hours had passed. In Billy's mind, that detail refused to settle. Rob was not someone who disappeared into quiet, especially not when family was involved. As more details emerged, the unease deepened. Rob and Michelle were not found together. They were in different locations inside the house. To Billy, this detail echoed something Rob had said weeks earlier, that tensions at home didn't explode all at once, but moved from room to room, unfolding in stages. The image was chilling not because it was dramatic, but because it felt familiar. What also stood out was what the house did not show. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder moving through the space. The furniture remained largely undisturbed. Nothing suggested an external threat. Everything looked like the home Billy had visited countless times, the same rooms, the same layout, the same everyday order. That normality made the scene harder to process, not easier. The reaction of the person who first entered the house stayed with Billy as well. Panic so immediate and overwhelming that they couldn't remain inside for more than a moment. It wasn't fear of the unknown. It was shock at something deeply personal and irreversible. Silence became the defining detail. Not just the silence inside the house, but the silence that stretched before anyone realized something was wrong. For Billy, it brought back the memory of Rob standing by the window weeks earlier, saying little, listening more than he spoke. This was when the meaning of home began to shift. It was no longer a place of safety or refuge. It became a space that had absorbed tension quietly, patiently, until there was nothing left to hold it back. What unsettled Billy Crystal most was not a detail from the house itself, but who wasn't there. When he learned that Nick Reiner was absent at the time the bodies were discovered, a familiar heaviness returned, the same feeling he had carried with him when he left Brentwood weeks earlier. It pulled his thoughts back to the private conversation he couldn't stop replaying. Over the years, Rob Reiner had spoken openly to Billy about Nick's struggles. The cycles were painfully familiar: periods of treatment, moments of hope, then relapses that drained the entire household. There were stretches when Nick seemed to vanish from family life altogether, cutting off contact and living transiently. Rob never hid his fear, but he also never stopped believing that staying close might keep his son from falling apart. That belief had taken shape in more than words. Being Charlie wasn't just another film to Rob, it was a final act of faith, the idea that creativity, purpose, and proximity could still pull his son back toward stability. To Rob, the project represented something deeper than art. It was hope carefully protected, even as the ground beneath it kept shifting. When details surfaced about a tense argument the night before the tragedy, an incident witnessed by others at a holiday gathering, Billy felt a chill. Those accounts echoed what Rob had described weeks earlier, moments when Nick's behavior became unpredictable, when emotional flare-ups arrived without warning. It was never a single event. It was a pattern tightening over time. Nick's absence from the house completed that pattern in Billy's mind. It didn't provide answers. It raised questions. Why wasn't he there? Who left the house before anyone realized what had happened? The distance between the home and where Nick was later detained only intensified those questions, not because it proved anything, but because it mirrored the kind of disoriented flight Rob had once feared. For Billy, the collapse wasn't only legal or tragic, it was symbolic. In that moment, something else fell apart as well, the belief that love, proximity, and art could always heal what was broken. The missing piece wasn't just Nick's location. It was the realization that the warning Rob had listened to might have arrived after hope had already taken its final shape. The moment Billy Crystal learned that Nick Reiner had been detained later that same day, something inside him quietly collapsed. It wasn't shock in the usual sense. It was recognition, immediate and heavy, arriving before emotion had time to soften it. Nick hadn't been found near the Brentwood home. He was located more than 20 kilometers away. To Billy, the distance mattered not as proof, but as pattern. It echoed what Rob Reiner had once described during moments of crisis periods when his son became disoriented, reactive, and unreachable. Seeing images of Nick in custody, restrained and distant, Billy didn't analyze them. He felt the weight of something clicking into place. This was the breaking point. Without saying it aloud, Billy understood what that realization meant. This was what he had warned about. Not a specific act, not a prediction of violence, but the loss of control, the point where love alone could no longer hold everything together. The warning had never been about fear. It had been about unpredictability quietly growing inside a home that refused to name it. As details of the case emerged, Billy followed from a distance. He avoided speculation and public reaction. What struck him instead was how quickly the story shifted from private grief into formal process. Conversations about family were replaced by legal language. Human pain gave way to procedures that moved forward without pause. In that shift, Billy's guilt hardened. Until then, he had replayed his final conversation with Rob, wondering whether he could have stayed longer or spoken more forcefully. Now the question changed. He knew exactly when the warning had been spoken and exactly when it had failed to alter anything. The realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with stillness. The same stillness Billy remembered from Rob's living room weeks earlier. The same silence that filled the house before anyone understood what had already been lost. From that moment, in the days that followed, Billy Crystal withdrew from the world in ways that worried those closest to him. He stopped answering casual calls, skipped familiar restaurants, and declined appearances that normally required only brief explanations. Grief was expected, but this felt heavier, settling into routines and quietly changing them completely. Nothing about it felt temporary or performative to anyone watching from the outside. At home, Billy replayed the final visit in Brentwood with obsessive clarity. He remembered tired eyes, an untouched glass of water, and pauses before every sentence. He remembered leaving at dusk, telling himself he had done what a friend should do, then carrying unease that refused to fade. Those details returned later, as questions without answers, circling the same thought again and again there. Billy had built his life around protecting family and emotional safety. He once said he never jokes about things that destroy families, believing some lines should never be crossed. That belief sharpened the guilt now. He hadn't ignored danger carelessly. He had trusted love to be stronger than fear. That choice defined him long before this moment and made the reckoning unavoidable for him. What tormented him most was not the outcome, but the moment before it. The warning had been spoken clearly and heard, yet he chose restraint over insistence, respect over intervention. He wondered whether staying longer, pressing harder, or returning the next day might have altered anything at all. Each possibility arrived too late to test and stayed there unanswered in his mind afterward alone. Sleep became difficult. Nights stretched while he stared at old messages he could barely read. Friends said he seemed present and absent at once. Billy did not blame Rob Reiner or Nick Reiner. He blamed himself for believing time would help and assuming care could replace boundaries. The silence he carried felt like responsibility, not anger. It stayed with him long after everyone else spoke ended. For nearly 5 decades, the bond between Billy Crystal and Rob Reiner was steady, unshowy, and deeply trusted. They met in the mid-1970s long before either imagined the weight their names would carry. What connected them was not ambition, but a shared way of seeing people, humor and vulnerability as inseparable. Rob was the first person Billy called when something went right and the one he turned to when nothing did. Success never changed that rhythm. When Rob stepped behind the camera, Billy wasn't simply an actor for him. He was a sounding board, a friend invited into the quiet work of shaping emotion, timing, and truth. Their collaboration on When Harry Met Sally became more than a career milestone. It symbolized a creative trust that mirrored their friendship, honest, disciplined, and rooted in respect. Billy often said Rob made him feel free without being unguarded, guided without being controlled. Losing Rob meant losing that balance. Billy didn't just lose a collaborator or a companion. He lost the person who steadied him when the world tilted. The irony was impossible to miss. Rob Reiner, a master of narrative control, could shape stories with precision, yet could not direct the most important story of his own life. In remembering Rob, Billy focused not on tragedy, but on presence, shared meals, open conversations, and the quiet warmth of a home that once felt safe. Those memories mattered more than any ending ever. Stories like this rarely offer closure. They leave behind silence, unanswered questions, and the uneasy feeling that something important was seen too early or said too gently. In the end, Billy Crystal did not speak to accuse or explain. He spoke to remember. And in remembering Rob Reiner, he reminded us that warnings do not always fail because they are wrong, but because people are not ready to hear them. This was never just about a crime scene, a timeline, or legal outcomes. It was about a home that slowly stopped feeling safe, a father trapped between love and fear, and a friend who spoke the truth yet still walked away. Knowing when care should remain patience, and when it must become action, is the hardest part. When tragedy finally arrives, it rewrites the past in painful ways. Silence becomes evidence. Time becomes the thing everyone wishes they had more of. What remains is not certainty, but responsibility. So we are left with a question that has no easy answer. Could this have been prevented? Or had everything already moved beyond control long before anyone was ready to name it? With care,